and continuing that bloodline on, which in those days was very important. Bloodline, having children, ancestry, very important to the Hebrew Israelites. Today, we'll be reading from Genesis 38 about Judah and Tamar. It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Elamite, whose name was Harah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son, and called his name Shelah. He was at Chezib when she bore him. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But ex-Judah's firstborn was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. And Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother." But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore he killed him also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown." For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted, and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it was told Tamar, saying, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, "What will you give me, that you may come in to me?" And he said, "I will send a young goat from the flock." So she said, "Will you give me a pledge till you send it?" Then he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" So she said, "Your signet and cord and your staff that is in your hand." Then he gave them to her, and went into her, and she conceived by him. So she arose and went away, and laid aside her veil, and put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside?" And they said, "There was no harlot in this place." So he returned to Judah and said, "I cannot find her." Also, the men of the place said there was no harlot in this place. Then Judah said, "Let her take them for herself, lest we be ashamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her." And it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry." So Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, Please determine who these are, the signet and cord and staff. So Judah acknowledged them and said, She had been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and he never knew her again. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put on his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, This one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, How did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. It's interesting to learn about Tamar. She was the daughter-in-law of Judah. Now Judah was the son of Jacob and Leah. Jacob is who was later named Israel. And Judah is the bloodline that Jesus came from. Now Judah got married to Shua, and they had Onan, and Shelah. Who was wicked and put to death by God, was Tamar's first husband. Judah, after passed away, was put to death by God because he was wicked. Judah told Onan to sleep with Tamar. Now this was due to the customs of the time. If we look here, the custom that called for Onan to father children to Tamar to carry on bloodline is similar to the custom described kinsman redeemer that is talked about in Ruth. The closest of kin was to father a child to carry on the line of the deceased husband. Now Onan didn't want to give Tamar children that would carry on bloodline. So what he did is, when they would have relations, he would relieve himself on the floor. So instead of impregnating Tamar, it would fall on the floor. And God saw this and deemed it as wicked. So he also put him to death, like he put to death. Now Shelah, he was a young child. So after Onan died, Judah promised Tamar that when Shelah gets older, she will be given to him in marriage, which never eventually happened. And it's interesting that it mentions that when Shua dies and Judah is recovered from his grief, he goes to Tamar to shear his sheep. That is interesting because so if we take a deeper dive into Tamar and her, I suppose, brush with prostitution, you might be asking, well, what, she veiled herself the whole time? And the answer is yes. At the time, in the ancient Near East, pagan people saw prostitution as an act of worship. They believed that fertility gods gave blessings if you practiced the act of having sexual intercourse with a prostitute. Now, these prostitutes were called shrine prostitutes, and that is who Tamar was, we assume, camouflaging herself as, because the shrine prostitutes would heavily veil themselves to create the illusion, because it was an act of worship as seen in the pagan religions, the shrine prostitutes would heavily veil themselves to create the illusion that the participant was having intercourse with the goddess herself. So the goddess that they were worshipping through that act. And the participant would then receive blessings from that fertility god that they were worshipping through that act with the prostitute, like a high yield crop or a good harvest, bountiful producing land and stuff like that. So could this explain Judah's intention when he had intercourse with Tamar, thinking that she was a prostitute? Was his intention to get a good harvest off his sheep? That's all speculation. And then we see in Genesis 38:24, 3 months later, Judah got told Tamar was prostituting and became pregnant, and he called for her to be put to death. Now, Judah at the time was not realizing that it was him who was actually responsible for Tamar's condition, being pregnant. To his credit, when he found out that Tamar was pregnant with his child, he did say that she's more righteous than he is, because he did not stick to his promise of giving her to his son Shelah, because Shelah was now of age when this all happened. Because in that time it was very shameful for a woman to be seen as barren, and because of what Onan was doing, she was plagued by this reputation of being barren, and that's why she went, and it says that she wore widowed garments, so she would have clothed herself in black while she stayed at her father's house, waiting for Shelah to become of age. And then when Judah didn't stick to his promise on that, I imagine she would have felt desperation, she would have felt betrayed, she would have felt let down. So she's created this mission for herself. And it's interesting when you think about that Judah showed little concern for his own bloodline and continuing that bloodline on, which in those days was very important. Bloodline, having children, ancestry, very important to the Hebrew Israelites. And in Judah showing little concern for his own bloodline, God used a woman who was widowed and shamed for barrenness to make sure that the tribe of Judah would survive. Tamar is one of only 5 female ancestors and 41 male ancestors of Jesus. God can bring such greatness from such a tragic sort of story, a woman's life. We see themes of pagan practices, prostitution, lies, fornication, and God was still able to bring Jesus, our Messiah, our Savior, through such a tainted situation. And so we can take comfort in that God's ability to bring blessings out of tragic, even sinful events is just as strong today in our lives than it was for Tamar in her time. So you might think you're too far gone. You might think you've made too many mistakes. You might think that what you've done is worse than anybody else, that there's no way God can make this right. But he can, because even through lies, fornication, and out of wedlock birth of twins, God was able to bring Jesus through all of that bloodline. And it's interesting when you look at the birth of the twins that Tamar gave birth to, Zerah's hand came out. So they put scarlet thread on his wrist, thinking that he was going to be the firstborn. But then Perez came out, and Perez means breaking out, because he then came out first. He became the firstborn, and Zerah means scarlet. From the Perez line, who they thought was going to be secondborn, but actually in the end became firstborn, from that line came King David, and hundreds of years later came Jesus Christ of Nazareth. So what do we learn from Tamar? We learn that when everybody in your life, because if you think of the men, so she was let down by she was then let down by Onan, she was then let down by Judah, because Judah promised Shelah to her and he let her down. I suppose in her mind she would have felt let down by Shelah too, even though it wasn't directly his fault. But all these men in Tamar's life continuously let her down, didn't keep their promises, and gave up on their responsibility towards her, essentially. In those moments where we feel like the whole world has left us for death, God is always there, and God is always working everything for his good. He can take fornication, he can take lies, he can take prostitution, and he can turn it into the bloodline of the Messiah. That's how great our God is, and that's the comfort that we should take when we think of Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah.